I'll give you a brief view of what are the current treatment standards for neuroendocrine tumour patients in Australia at the moment. Give you a view of what questions are outstanding and what sort of questions and some of the background we're asking ourselves in Australia, and in terms of what clinical trials are running in Australia as well. Some of those trials are trials developed by Australians, funded partly by government, funded partly by Unicorn Foundation, and others are funded by pharmaceutical companies. So, just to give you a brief view of research in Australia, we're a small island in the rest of the pharmaceutical oncology world, and we really are the poor cousins in relationship to Europe, to the US, and now to Asia in terms of funding research from pharmaceutical companies, drug access from pharmaceutical companies, and there are sort of particular early phase trials which Australia does get access to, which is very, very rare. And we're seen as a very, very small market. Australia makes up about 0.1% of the global pharmaceutical company. And we often see drugs approved, when I was on the government committees, drugs approved in places like Israel and Peru for funding, etc., by the companies making applications to those countries. By the time Australia is then asked to consider these drugs, we're way down the track. And the problem with the neuroendocrine tumour patients is that we are small numbers. Very, very small numbers compared to giants like breast cancer, prostate cancer, etc. And therefore the political impact and the impact that they have on politicians is quite low. And we also have lack of centralised net care, where if you go to certain European countries, they have centres of excellence where all NET patients are shunted to. Where in Australia we have activity along the major southeastern Australian seaboard, and you have some activity in the regional centres or in private clinics. Therefore, it's quite dispersed compared to other places like Europe, for example. So I'll give you a little background in terms of NET treatment. I'll talk to you about some of the research data behind current trials running in Australia and the actual NET studies. As you know, we classify our patients based upon tumour grade, and we really have the pathologist look at the tumour specimen underneath the microscope. We ask them the question, are they grade 1, are they grade 2, grade 3, based upon how they look underneath the microscope, based upon how the cells are dividing underneath the microscope. But all have malignant potential. All these tumours will tend to grow at some stage or another. And the way that we do things here, we individualise treatment. All patients are different. No patients are the same. And we base our treatment decisions based upon their tumour grade, the extent of the tumour and how well it's spread, based upon their CT scans and MRIs, and also based upon PET imaging. And I'm sure Rod will talk to you about that as well. And this is sort of the 4 pillars of treatment of NET patients. One is surgery. And if we can try and remove the tumour, we do, and Ben Thompson will talk about that. But sometimes we also do debulking surgery, where we remove almost all the tumour we can, but there's always some left behind, or prevent complications. We try and reduce the symptoms related from the tumour itself or by the hormones that they secrete, such as the somatostatin analogues or PRRT, for example. Or we try and slow the growth of the tumours by various ways, including somatostatin analogues, biological agents, PRRT, and chemotherapy. Or we have a group of patients where we just watch. And we can watch these patients for months or even years. I certainly have a number of patients I watch for a number of years, and disease remains the same. They're asymptomatic, and they're quite happy to go on with their life without any treatment. And we base our treatment, if they do have patients with metastatic disease, and we subclassify their disease based upon tumour grade. There's a whole variety of different treatments for each of those different tumour grades. It includes the somatostatin analogues, PRRT, biological agents, and chemotherapy as well. Whole combinations of one or the other. And they often in sequence as well, because as Simone said, these patients do live a long time, and therefore they can be exposed to many, many different treatments along the line as well. But what we don't know is, what's the best sequence? What's the best sequence in terms of using somatostatin analogues first, followed by chemotherapy or biologicals or PRT? Which is best to use first, second, or third? What's the best treatment for high-grade neuroendocrine tumours? We really haven't really got a handle on that. We really are not very good at identifying those patients generally that will respond to treatment or who will not respond to treatment. And we're really also not good in terms of predicting patients who will benefit from response. So there's a lot of unknowns there. And there's some new data now impacting on our current trial design. This is the NETA study, which is the first randomized trial of PRRT versus somatostatin analogues in patients with small bowel neuroendocrine tumours that had progressed on standard dose somatostatin analogue. And in terms of radiological response, about 80% of patients that had PRRT versus sandostatin LAR at higher dose responded. But more importantly is this. This is a survival curve, an interim survival curve. This is a proportion of patients surviving from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100% versus time out to about 3 years, this is months. The green line is those patients that receive PRRT on the NETA trial, and the black line is those patients that receive high-dose somatostatin analogue. And these patients that receive the somatostatin analogue had a median survival of about 20 months. We still haven't reached the median for PRRT. This is the first trial that's demonstrated that PRRT does provide an overall survival benefit, does provide very marked benefit in tumour control. And it's the first time it's been shown that from a trial that's run in Europe and in the US as well. And will really promote and increase the amount of PRRT be done in those centres where previously it was not set up. We also have the RADIANT-4 trial, which is we're using a drug called everolimus versus placebo in those patients with lung and gastrointestinal tract neuroendocrine tumours, including pancreas and small bowel. And again, this is a proportion of 0 to 100% of patients versus time. The blue line is those patients receiving everolimus. The red line is the placebo, showing that those patients receiving everolimus had longer duration of tumour control versus placebo. For small bowel nets, pancreatic nets, lung nets. And we're also starting to use more active chemotherapy regimens now. This is a summary slide from a paper produced by Mustafa Kershaw in Sydney, looking at combination chemotherapy regimens, mainly using temozolomide, which is an oral chemotherapy drug, showing very good response rates in this group of patients. And in terms of grade 3 neuroendocrine carcinomas, we're really stuck. We've been using the same regimens now in terms of platinum regimens for the last 15, 20 years, and really have not made any substantial improvement in this group of patients. So, what questions are we asking through trials in Australia? First one is PRRT better than chemotherapy? Is PRRT combined with chemotherapy better than PRRT alone? Is PRRT better than everolimus? And are there better treatments for high-grade neuroendocrine carcinomas? What about immunotherapy, which is a question we get asked all the time now? This is a paper produced by Harvey Turner and Phil Claringbold in Western Australia, and they combined PRRT with chemotherapy, a regimen called capecitabine and temozolomide, in 30 patients, and they had an overall response rate of about 80%. And in their hands, complete remission occurred in 13%. I don't think we've ever seen a complete response, Rod. No, we haven't. So 1 or 2, yes. And these patients had very, very good medians of progression-free survival of about 48 months with reasonable toxicity as well, showing you that combining PRRT with chemotherapy is a very active regimen. So we now have the Control Nets trial, a trial which has been designed by Harvey Turner and Nick Pavlakis, run through the AGITG with funding by the Unicorn Foundation. And it's a trial asking 2 questions. The first group of patients are those with pancreatic neuroendocrine tumours, and they are randomised to chemotherapy alone, capecitabine temozolomide, versus PRT with capecitabine temozolomide. And the second part of the question is, in most patients with mid-gut neuroendocrine tumours, they're randomised to PRT alone or PRT with chemotherapy. So we're asking the question, in pancreatic NETs, is chemotherapy better than chemotherapy with PRT? And in those patients with small bowel neuroendocrine tumours, is chemotherapy with PRT better than PRT alone? And we're looking at response rates, overall survival, toxicity, quality of life, and resource utilisation. It's a trial funded by the Unicorn Foundation. We next have this trial, which is called the COMPETE trial, where it's being sponsored by a German company providing a form of PRT. And they're randomising patients to either PRT alone versus everolimus. It's answering the question, is PRT better than everolimus in neuroendocrine tumours? It's a very important question. And I think the PRT would win, I would think, based upon the NETA trial. On progression, it does allow patients to receive PRT. So it's actually a very nice study. It gives patients access to everolimus, which is not funded by the PBS except for pancreatic neuroendocrine tumours, and it gives access to PRT where patients would normally get that because of funding issues from the various centres. And that trial is running at Peter Mac and North Shore Hospital in Sydney as well. And the primary objective is to show that PRT with lutetium prolongs the progression-free survival compared to everolimus. We have next the NABNEC trial. And this is a trial in grade 3 neuroendocrine carcinomas. It's funded by the NHMRC through AGITG, and it's being led by Mustafa Korshaw. And it's asking the question, is there a better regimen for high-grade neuroendocrine carcinomas, which tend to be very rapidly growing and very poor prognosis? And it's randomising patients to our standard carboplatin etoposide versus carboplatin with a formulation of Taxol, which is a nanoparticle formulation of Taxol, with endpoints in terms of response rate, secondary endpoints in terms of survival, and there's a whole variety of other laboratory-type research which is being tacked onto this as well. We get a lot of questions about immunotherapy trials, mainly with the drugs called the immune checkpoint inhibitors. The tumour cells have a way of hiding from the immune system, and they do that by what they've called a protein called PD-L1 from the tumour cell, and it binds to this protein here called PD-1 on the T cell. The T cell is an immune cell, and it turns the immune cells off so that the tumour can grow without stimulating the immune system, and it can grow happily. Unlike if you have a viral infection, the immune system will get on top of that and try and kill it. We now have antibodies which can block PD-L1 from binding from PD-1. It basically stops the immune system being turned off and switches the immune system on. And now these drugs are being used in melanoma, they're being used now in lung cancer, in Merkel cell carcinoma, kidney cancer, etc. We now have this phase 2 trial of an immune checkpoint inhibitor called PDR001 in patients with advanced and metastatic neuroendocrine tumours, either from the gastrointestinal tract or from the lungs, which is now soon to be opened at Peter Mac and Royal North Shore Hospital. And it's really the first such study devoted to NET patients in this group. And basically these patients have non-functional NETs from the lung or gastrointestinal tracts or pancreas, and they're treated with the immune checkpoint inhibitor, and the primary endpoint is overall response. So hopefully we open in the second quarter of next year. There are obviously other research, and you'll be hearing about laboratory studies from our subsequent speakers, We also have an Australian-wide database of NET patients to try and gather demographic details and also imaging details on these patients. There's also a number of quality of life studies being looked at in various NET centres in Queensland, New South Wales and in Victoria as well. And also in Peter Mac, we're also now having our first dietitian doing a PhD on the nutritional aspects of NET patients as well, doing research. Thank you.